me take you back to Singapore in the 1930s. Most of the island was covered by mangrove swamps, coconut and rubber plantations, fishing villages, country roads. But in the midst of that, there were tall buildings, motor vehicles, and the busiest trolley bus system in the world at that time. And you can see in one of the pictures the Fullerton Hotel, which if you just poke your head out there, you'll see as well. In the midst of this modernity, Singapore, however, was plagued with poor sanitation, water supply problems, opium dens, and tigers. Now, work at the time might have consisted of back-breaking labor on a construction site. It might have involved loading and unloading cargo from boats that came in off the Singapore River. It might have involved pulling a rickshaw, or it might have involved working in the leather factory. Now, work at that time in Singapore did not differ significantly from work elsewhere in the world. And it is in that context that I want to introduce you to John Maynard Keynes. John Maynard Keynes was a British philosopher, economist, and statesman. And in 1930, he was trying to cast his view out 100 years into the future. And he wrote an essay called The Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. And he was trying to project what life might look like in 2030. Now, his perspective was that up until that point in time, there had been very little technological innovation, which meant that work, as we knew it, had not changed materially. However, he forecasted that with the introduction of technology, we would, in 100 years, have solved the economic problem, which was that of subsistence. And he predicted that we would be working 3-hour shifts, 5 days a week, 15-hour work weeks. And he predicted that our standard of living would be 4 to 8 times that of the time in 1930. Now, how many of you feel here that you're actually working less than you did before? Okay, not very many, clearly. However, the data would actually show that, in fact, over time, the number of hours we're working has, in fact, decreased. Furthermore, as countries become wealthier, they actually work fewer hours, unless you're in Singapore. So I'll leave you to ponder that. But in fact, when you think about technological innovation, just using household chores as an example, it used to take 58 hours to do the cooking, the cleaning, and the laundry, and this had dropped dramatically over time with the introduction of things like the refrigerator, the oven, the microwave, the washer, and the dryer. A couple of economists at Deloitte did a study that looked at data from the census of England and Wales from 1871, and they were trying to understand how jobs had changed and how technology had actually affected those jobs. So using one example, they looked at the job of doing laundry, right? And in 1901, with a population of around 30 million, there were 200,000 people involved in the job of laundering. Fast forward, that number had declined significantly to only about 35,000 people. So indeed, one of the conclusions was that technology does indeed displace jobs. What then does this mean for the future of work? And presumably you're in here because you're wondering how this affects you personally. Let me introduce you to my niece and nephew, who are 9 and 11. Ondine wants to be a vet. Lucien's passion is in building complex structures. Now, in about 11 years, which is the year 2030, they'll be ready to go out into the workforce. Any of you have kids around that age? Young children? All right, so you're curious to look at what the world might look like, because I don't know what the job of a vet or an architect looks like in 11 years, but we can cast our future forward to take a look at what that might look like. So let's take a look at what the world could look like in 2030. When you look out into the future, it is sometimes difficult to imagine what that could look like barely 11 years from now. Some of you may remember the Cray computer. Others of you have no idea at all what this is. But essentially, the amount of computing power that required a room in 1985 could be captured in the size of an iPad in 2011, in the palm of your hands. Actually, for proportion to be more like that. With the rise of computing technology and what it's able to do, combined with genetics, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, robotics, we're seeing a convergence of multiple factors that are building on each other and creating change at an exponential rate. Remember the Human Genome Project? This was launched in 1990 and officially declared complete in 2003. The cost? $3 billion to sequence the first human genome. Fast forward to today, you can get a human genome sequence for $1,000. And if you were paying attention last year, for just 2 days, a company in Cambridge was offering a special offer. $999 genome sequencing solution was offered for $199. Ladies and gentlemen, we are not far from the $99 human genome. You heard it here first. Now, besides computing power, besides genetics, a lot of the discussion so far has been around artificial intelligence. What does that look like, and what's that capable of doing, and how's that going to affect our lives? Let's take a look. Actually know how it distinguishes between a bicycle and a motorbike, but I suppose you have to train it. Kind of like this. Is this a bagel or a sleeping dog? Blueberry muffin, a chihuahua? You may never look at blueberry muffins or chihuahuas the same way ever again. And for the cat lovers among you, a kitten or caramel ice cream. So you have to train the artificial intelligence. But the point being really that the convergence of all these different factors are creating lots of new jobs that don't exist today. Back in 2013, this is one prediction of the top jobs that we would see in 2030. And this is usually the point where many people in the audience start whipping out the cameras. Yeah, like you and you and you. Lots of you taking out cameras because you're interested to see, well, what's going to happen in 2030, right? I have bad news for you. I have really, really bad news for you because here we are in 2019 and many of these jobs already exist. Body part maker? Check. I have a friend who is a doctor and he claims that you can pretty much replace any part in the body with the exception of the brain. Vertical farmer? Indeed, right here in Singapore. Social media manager? Absolutely. Hot jobs. So, as much as we think that we can predict the future, we fall woefully short because our ability to imagine what's out there is falling far short of the advances and the possibilities that are being made possible by the technology ahead of us. What does this mean to you? You know, if you go into Google and you type will machines, this is what you get. Clearly, this is something that we're all worried about. Will machines replace humans? Will machines replace doctors? Will machines take over my job? The University of Oxford actually did a study to look at which of the jobs might be most at risk of automation. It's a pretty sophisticated paper. You can actually download it and read the details. But fortunately, what they've done is they actually put it together in a website. Oh, and I see some of you already starting to enter this into your phone. Basically, what you can do is you can go into the website and you can type in your job there and say, will robots take my whatever job it is? And they looked at over 700 jobs in the US and found that 47% of them could be done by machines within a decade or two. Even a portion of a CEO's job is not immune to automation. And indeed, there are some things that we'd probably much rather not do. So automation is ahead of us. What does that mean then in terms of what we can do to future-proof ourselves? Here are 5 key takeaways in terms of how to prepare ourselves for the future. The first is about learn, work, and play. You see, in parallel with the advances in technology and the shrinking business cycles, we are seeing a growth in our global life expectancy. You know, a company on the S&P 500 in the 1960s was on the S&P 500 for about 60 years, and our lifespan was about 60 years. So you could actually do that one thing with that one company and then move on to bigger and better things. Today, the average lifespan of a company, the S&P 500, is only about 20 years. So how do we make this increased life expectancy a blessing and not a curse? Back in 2013, the National Geographic predicted that a baby born then would live to be 120. A pretty audacious prediction, wouldn't you say? But not less than 2 years later, Time magazine came up with a competing cover, basically saying that this baby could live to be 142 years old. So you see the compression in lots of different dimensions, including how long we're expected to live. I introduced to you 2 books. One is called The 3 Boxes of Life. It was published in 1978, but I think is as relevant as it is then as it is today. And the second is The 100-Year Life, published in 2016. Contrasted by a number of decades, but both with a very critical message, which is, whereas in the past we would learn, work, and play in sequence, today it's about putting them all together. So you would go to school, you would study for whatever degree you wanted to study for, and you would say, woohoo, I've graduated, time to move on and get myself a job. You would then work for many years in a job, moving up in the profession, climbing the ladder, as they would say, and looking forward to that one day when you say, I'm going to retire. Well, in an environment where we're living to 65 years old, you retire when you're 62, that probably works. But in an environment where business cycles and business models are 20 years and we're living to 80 years, it looks much more like this, where we learn, work, and play in tandem all the time. So continuing to improve ourselves, learning new skills, preparing ourselves for those jobs that do not yet exist today. So key takeaway, learn, work, and play concurrently. Number 2, this is about developing a broad radar. Have any of you heard of the 5 stages of grief? Happens when you're going through a grieving process. And typically the first stage of grief is shock. What happened? Second, denial. No, that can't be. 3, anger. 4, despair. And then finally, acceptance. I think this applies equally to the 5 stages of disruption. It is so easy to get stuck at denial. Let me take you back to history again. This is the Easter parade in New York City, 1910 versus 1913. What do you notice is the difference in these photos? On the left photo, you see horses and buggies. And on the right photo, in just 3 years, they had been replaced by cars. And meanwhile, a very common sentiment was of this British MP, I do not believe the introduction of motor cars will ever affect the riding of horses. It is so easy to be stuck in denial. So having a broad radar helps open up the possibilities. Take, for example, Kodak and Fuji. Now, most of you know the story about Kodak and how they missed the digital revolution. So we're not going to talk about that today. What I want to share with you is the story of Fuji. So Fujifilm, again, some of you in this room recognize those canisters, and some of you have never seen a film canister in your life. So Fuji, at the time, saw that the world was changing. So they decided to go on a strategy that first, figured out how to milk the existing business, second, prepare for digital, and third, move into new areas. Did you know that as a consequence, Fuji makes a very well-known line of cosmetics called Astelift? Now, how does a photography company get into cosmetics? Well, as it turns out, photographic film is 50% collagen, which of course is what our skin is made of. And for photographic film to last, you need to be very good at understanding antioxidation. So combining these 2 skills, Fuji looked very broadly and said, well, we have core skills, we understand collagen, we understand antioxidation, put them together, and we moved into a brand new business. You can look at that from the business perspective, you can also look at it from the individual perspective. What are those things that you do today that could be translated into something that applies in the future? Do so by having a broad radar. Number 3, build diverse networks. A lot of the research has shown that when we have diverse networks, we actually combine and collectively create ideas that are much more powerful than when you put together people that are of a similar background and history. So when you think about building diversity of networks, it's important to think about, well, how do I go out and reach out to people who are different than me? It's 2019. You would expect that we're fairly globally connected. A study that was done out of NYU, it's actually the DHO Global Connectedness Index. It's been running for the last several years. And the study really looks at the flow of trade, capital, information, and people across borders. As it turns out, in 2018, the most recent year of this study, which was just released a couple of months ago, we are actually more globally connected than ever before, in spite of all the rhetoric that we might hear about around anti-globalization. Having said that, what percentage of international phone calls do you think are international calls? All phone calls, including VoIP, what percentage would you guess that would be? 20%? 50%? In fact, only 7% of phone calls are international. Only 26% of internet traffic is international. And only 3% of people live outside the country of their birth. This tells us that we are creatures of habit. We stay close to home. We stay close to what's nearest to us. So it takes effort to actually build out diverse networks. Left to our own devices, we tend to be with other people who are like us, who have similar backgrounds, who have similar interests. So in order to build a diverse network, you actually need to push out beyond that and make an effort to build a network which will help make your network a lot more resilient as you prepare for the future. Number 4, drive change from within. Remember the rickshaw drivers we talked about earlier? Well, at some point, they too were disrupted at the time by buses. There's a lovely story in the 1971 Straits Times that basically said that the trishaws were being displaced by the shiny buses and the taxis of their time. And Mr. Coe, as interviewed in this article, basically said, "I saw the way things were going, and I became a taxi driver." And that is what driving change from within is about. It's about understanding, breaking our mental barriers, and identifying how we can push past that which we are familiar with. But very often, we're hamstrung by our beliefs. For example, can you teach a coal miner how to code? It's an appropriate question given the forum that we're in. In Kentucky, which was a very heavily coal mining community, one of the communities there, they actually tried this. So let me share with you the video.
BitSource is a software development company. We have around 13 employees. Several of those employees, 10 of them, they had been laid off from the coal mines, and now they are actually programmers. So we taught them how to program and develop websites, apps.
You're not going to teach the normal coal miner to code. No.
We started with HTML, of course, and then we learned CSS. Went from there to JavaScript. We're having a little bit of motivation by starvation. When it's not there anymore, you've got to go find something else to do.
We began talks about, okay, could we do this? And what would we do if we could teach a coal miner to code? Of course you can. I mean, they're no different than anybody else learning anything. They're just engineers that get dirty.
So it's about challenging stereotypes, and it's about breaking past our own perceptions of what we can do, or perhaps other people on our team might be able to do, and pushing them into new areas as we move into the future. Reinvention is going to be very, very critical, and it's about driving that change from within. Very often it's the self-limiting mindsets that we need to get past. Number 5, live wisely and well. If we think about how work is changing, and if you think about how we have been able to actually have a much better standard of living today than we had in the past. In fact, modern economists would say that we're about 4 to 5 times better off than we were in 1930, and we could be 8 times by 2030. What do we do then with that time? And is that actually going to happen? Take a look at what Jack Ma had to say about this.
Believe it or not, I think next 30 years, people only work 4 hours a day and maybe 4 days a week. My grandfather worked 16 hours a day in the farmland to dig in. He thinks he's very busy. We work 8 hours, 5 days a week. We think we are very busy. By the next 30 years, people only work 4 hours.
Which brings us back to John Maynard Keynes. You see, the reason why he was looking at the economic possibilities of the grandchildren was to really try to understand what life would be like in 2030. And one of the things that he said was, it would not be harmful for us to think about how we could learn to live the art of life itself. Because as we progress into technological obsolescence of jobs, there will be time And how do we then frame our purpose? It really depends on how well we are prepared for that. You see, the purpose of work is not its objective and end game of itself, but really work is currency. And when we think about the future of work, it's really important to be thinking about, what do we want to buy with that currency? How do we define our purpose? And if our sole identity and sole purpose is in the job and in the work, and when that transforms and moves into something else, we need something to catch that ball. We need to be able to define our purpose beyond work itself. And that is the purpose of living. So, ladies and gentlemen, while we think about the future of work and the disruptive forces that it has upon us, what I urge you to do is to come back to these 5 key takeaways. Number 1, learn, play, and work concurrently. It's never too late to move into a completely different skill set. Many of the leaders that I work with have been in professions for 20 years. They are experts in their field. They are top lawyers, top programmers, top CFOs, top marketing folks. And then, after the 20-year chapter, they decide, well, it's time for something else. Well, what is that something else? You want to be starting that learning now. Don't wait till that point in time to be thinking about that learning. So learn as you go. And by the way, don't think of retirement as the destination. There is no destination. It's going to be embedding play and embedding learning into work and life itself. Remember to develop a broad radar, for it is by connecting seemingly unconnected dots that very often we open ourselves up to possibilities. And learn about different things, build a diverse network, and really focus on driving change within. What are those beliefs that we have held within ourselves? What are the things that are holding us back? Why do we not think we can do something and move into a different field? Because over the course of our careers and our lives, we're going to reinvent ourselves multiple times. And lastly, remember that in the future of work, it is not just about work, but it is about the living as well. Thank you very much. You've been a wonderful audience. If you'd like to catch up with me separately, and feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, but please use the hashtag OOWSIN. Thank you very much.